All right, everybody, let's not mess around today because I have a lot to go over. And thank you to about the 350 of you who voted for this to get to the top of the output list. Listen, over 37 years of television sitcoms, who is the punchline? Is it men or women? Let's finally settle this. I analyzed nearly 12 hours of video from 4 major ensemble sitcoms: Cheers, Friends, How I Met Your Mother, and The Big Bang Theory. Now, across those samples, I identified 990 separate instances of demeaning behavior and coded who delivered it, who it targeted, and whether those patterns changed after accounting for the number of spoken words by men and women in the shows. After more than 40 hours of putting this together and organizing it with the help of ChatGPT, the answer is not as simple as saying that either men or women are ridiculed more. In some shows, men were the majority of targets. In others, women were. What I was interested in was, when women demean or ridicule someone, who is their target? That's where these 4 shows, spanning from the early 1980s until nearly 2020, start looking remarkably similar. So I'll try to keep this as brief but informative as I can. First, I'll briefly explain how and why each of the 4 sitcoms were selected for analysis. I'll also describe what counted as demeaning or ridiculing those incidents and how the analysis was done. And then we'll go through each show's results individually. We'll look at the raw results, the dialogue-adjusted results, and who was doing the demeaning, and most importantly, who women and men chose as their targets. Now, I'll also address one major complication with How I Met Your Mother, the Barney effect. And before we're all done, I'll put all 4 of these shows side by side, and we'll have a look at what's changed across these 37 years and what didn't. So the 4 shows were selected to give a reasonably comparable group of adult ensemble sitcoms with mixed gender cast, while also covering several decades of television. Cheers represents the 1980s, Friends, the 1990s and early 2000s, How I Met Your Mother, the 2000s and 2010s, and then The Big Bang Theory carries the sample all the way through to 2019. Now, these were selected because there was enough long-form compilation material available on YouTube for me to download the video transcripts so that I could analyze substantial amounts of dialogue rather than isolated clips from a whole bunch of dozens and hundreds of different videos. Now, 3 of the 4 show samples came from official show or network channels. How I Met Your Mother was the exception because I couldn't find any extensive videos for that show on YouTube, so I used a lengthy viewer-created compilation video. The goal was to create a consistent cross-decade sample of popular comedies that could be coded using the same rules. Now, listen to this. To get to the punchline aspect of this analysis, I was interested in demeaning or ridiculing statements. So for this purpose, a demeaning incident was a discrete joke, a remark, a clearly described action that belittled somebody. Maybe there was some humiliation, a negative stereotype, infantilized somebody, someone was objectified, attacked someone's competence, appearance, durability, social worth, status, all of those things, right? So that's what we're looking for here. And each show's transcript was then reviewed subsequently, and qualifying incidents were coded by target gender and, when identifiable, the source gender, with repeated versions of the same joke counting only once, and ambiguous cases were excluded. Okay, so then the amount of dialogue was then used as an exposure check so that raw totals and counts, they could then be compared to how much men and women actually spoke in the transcripts, and think of that as on-screen time. And all of this is explained in far greater detail in my process documentation. If you want to go deeper, I'm putting an article along with all of the supporting material on Substack for those supporters. The show transcripts, the full methods and coding process, outcome documents for each of the 4 shows, and a separate combined results comparison. So all of that is available for anyone who wants to examine the methods and analysis in more detail, or hell, even go ahead and do a test of different hypotheses on your own. It's all there for you. Altogether, that's roughly 30 pages of documentation, even without the show transcripts. So there's a lot more behind this analysis than I can reasonably cover here with you today. All right, let's dive into this. Let's talk about Cheers. With the help of ChatGPT, we analyzed roughly 2 hours and 45 minutes of cheers and identified 132 instances of demeaning behavior. I will put up as many overlays here as I can to kind of keep you on track. Like I said, I want to get through this succinctly, if we can. Now, if we start with the simplest possible question think of it as a sort of research question or a hypothesis, who gets demeaned more often? And with cheers, the answer is men. Male characters were the targets in 89 incidents compared with 43 that involved female targets. That's about 67% male and 33% female targets, or just over 2/3 were men. But those raw numbers don't tell the whole story because the dialogue in the material was also heavily male. All right, so hope you can keep up. Men accounted for about 74% of the dialogue that we could classify by gender, while women accounted for only about 26% of the dialogue. So men had many more opportunities to be involved in those scenes in the first place. Once we accounted for that difference in character presence, things really changed. Relative to the amount of dialogue that each gender had, women were targeted at a modestly higher rate than men, roughly 1.3 times the male rate. Now, that's useful tech context, so I don't want to leave that out. But it also brings us back to the actual question that I'm interested in here. The question is not who gets demeaned more often in cheers. The more specific question is, when women are doing the demeaning and ridiculing, who is the punchline? And this is where the result becomes even more interesting. We were able to identify the gender source of the demeaning content of 130 of 132 incidents. Men delivered more of those incidents overall, 89 compared with 41 from women. But we would expect that because, again, men have more lines in the show. They just have more stage or more screen presence. So if somebody asks, who does more of the demeaning in Cheers, the answer would be men. But that's a totally different question. What I wanted to know was what happens within those 41 incidents that were delivered by women. And here's that breakdown. Of those 41 incidents, 29 were directed at male characters, only 12 directed at other female characters. That means about 71% of the demeaning humor that was delivered by women was aimed at men, compared with about 29% that was aimed at other women. So in other words, when a woman demeans somebody, she was about 2.5 times as likely to target a man as other women. And the reciprocal comparison hits home even harder. When men delivered demeaning humor, they also targeted other men more often than women. Of the 89 male-delivered incidents, 58 were directed at men and 31 at women. So only about 35% of the demeaning humor delivered by men and targeted toward women compared to 71% targeting men. And when we adjust the amount of demeaning humor that women delivered relative to their dialogue exposure, women actually delivered demeaning content at an estimated rate of about 1.3 times the male rate. So specific to the question that we're examining here, when women were the ones who delivered demeaning comments in their humor, their preferred target was clearly men. So I'll do this for each of the four as we go. I'll answer these questions here. Are men punchlines for women in Cheers? And the answer is yes. About 71% of women's demeaning humor targeted men. And the second question is, are women punchlines for men? Here, no, not really at all. Only about 35% of men's demeaning humor was targeted toward women. All right, let's go ahead now and talk about Friends. Here we analyzed roughly 2 hours and 53 minutes of material and identified 180 qualifying instances of demeaning humor. If we again begin with the simplest question, who gets demeaned more often, the answer again is men. Male characters were the targets in 117 demeaning comments compared with 63 involving female targets. That's 65% male and 35% female. But unlike what we saw with Cheers, the dialogue in Friends was much more evenly divided between men and women. So men accounted for about 55% of the dialogue that we could classify by gender, while women accounted for about 45%. There is a reason that the dialogue between the sexes, between the genders in Friends exists. It was actually built into the show. So the large difference in the raw target numbers can't simply be explained by men having dramatically more dialogue or appearing much more frequently in their material. In fact, once we adjust for the target numbers for dialogue exposure, the male target pattern is actually stronger. Male characters in Friends experienced about 9.7 demeaning incidents per 1,000 male spoken words, compared with about 6.4 incidents per 1,000 words of female spoken words. Now that means that men were targeted at roughly 1.5 times the female rate, even after accounting for the amount of dialogue that each group had. So on Friends, men weren't merely the targets more often in raw numbers. They were also targeted more frequently relative to their representation in the dialogue or on screen. But again, that's only part of the question that we're interested in here. The more specific question is, when women are doing the demeaning, who is the punchline? And Friends gives us a particularly interesting result. We were able to identify the source of the demeaning content in 179 of the 180 incidents. Men delivered 107 of those, while women delivered 72. So just as with Cheers, if somebody asks just a broad question, who does most of the demeaning overall, the answer is men. But let's look specifically at what happened within those 72 instances that were delivered by women. Of those 72, 59 were directed at male characters and 13 were directed at female characters. So that means about 82% of the demeaning humor delivered by women was aimed at men, compared with only about 18% that was aimed at other women. So when a woman delivered a demeaning joke or remark in Friends, she was about 4.5 times likely to target a man as opposed to another woman. And that is considerably more lopsided than what we even found for Cheers. Again, the reciprocal comparison is also revealing here. When men delivered demeaning humor on Friends, their targets were much more evenly divided. Of the 107 male-delivered incidents, 57 targeted men and 50 targeted women. So that's about 53% of men's demeaning humor was directed towards other men and 47% was directed at women. That's close to an even split. Now, women, by contrast, showed nothing even close to a split. More than 4 out of every 5 incidents that they delivered were directed at men. So when we narrow the question to who women themselves target with demeaning humor, the result is especially pronounced. Women directed 59 of their 72 incidents towards men. That's roughly 82% compared to 47% the other way around. Are men the punchlines for women? Yes, absolutely. About 82% of women's demeaning humor targeted men. On the other flip side of this, are women punchlines for men in the sitcom? And the answer is no, not really. Only about 47% of men's demeaning humor targeted women, while the majority targeted other men. Let's talk about How I Met Your Mother. Here we analyzed 3.5 hours of material and identified 457 qualifying instances of demeaning humor. And again, starting with the question, who gets demeaned more often? This show immediately looks different from Cheers and Friends. Female characters were the targets in 267 incidents compared to 190 that involved male targets. That's a 58% female to 42% male split. Those were the receiving people. So even before making any adjustments for exposure, women were the most frequent targets of demeaning humor in the material that we analyzed. That's what's different from the first two. And the difference is even larger once we consider the amount of dialogue. Among the dialogue that we could confidently assign by gender, men accounted for about 72% of the spoken words, while women accounted for only about 28%. All right, so these are spoken words in the transcript taken from the television show. But again, the broader target comparison is not the only question that we're interested in. The specific question, again, is when women are doing the demeaning, who is the punchline? We were able to identify the gender of the source for 446 of the 457 incidents. Men delivered 339 of those, while women delivered 107. So again, if we simply ask, who does more of the demeaning in How I Met Your Mother, the answer is clearly men, just like in the first two shows. About 3/4 of all of the identifiable demeaning content came from male characters. But now let's look at specifically those 107 incidents delivered by women. Of those, 89 were directed at male characters. Only 18 were directed at other female characters. That means about 83% of the demeaning humor delivered by women was aimed at men, compared with about 17% toward other women. Now, essentially, when a woman delivered a demeaning or ridiculing message in humor, she was almost 5 times as likely to target a man as another woman. But there's also one important wrinkle with this show, so I did a post hoc analysis, and that's the Barney effect. In How I Met Your Mother, Barney contributes far more demeaning humor than any other male character. At the character level attribution of the 339 male-delivered incidents, Barney accounted for 168, or almost about 50% of them. Ted accounted for about 102 or 30%, Marshall about 55 remarks, or about 16%, and then there were a few that had come from other characters, other male characters. They combined for only 4%. That's exactly what his character was: arrogant, sexist, and condescending. So Barney is clearly a major reason that How I Met Your Mother looks different from the first two shows. But back to the full analysis. When we separate the humor by gender of the person delivering it, the direction is strikingly reciprocal, very similar. Women overwhelmingly demeaned men, while men overwhelmingly demeaned women. So here are those two questions, final questions for this one. Are men punchlines for women in How I Met Your Mother? And the answer is yes. About 83% of women's demeaning humor was targeted toward men. And how about the other way around? In How I Met Your Mother, are women punchlines for men? And here the answer is yes. About 73% of men's demeaning humor targeted women. Thanks, Barney. All started with a Big Bang. Now let's move on for the Big Bang Theory. Here we analyzed roughly 2 hours and 56 minutes of material and identified 221 instances of demeaning humor. As you would expect, who gets demeaned more often? The answer for the fourth time is men. Male characters were the targets of 152 of the 221 incidents, and there were then 69 instances of female targets. That's about 69% male targets and 31% female targets. But as with Cheers, those raw numbers, again, need some important context because the dialogue in the material was so very heavily male with this show. Overall, men accounted for about 80% of the dialogue that we could easily classify by gender. So that leaves women at about a 20% presence. So once again, male characters had substantially more exposure or airtime and far more opportunities, again, to be involved in those scenes. And once we adjusted for the target totals based on dialogue and exposure, men made up about 80% of the identifiable dialogue in the sample, and they received 152 of the 221 demeaning incidents, or about 69%. Female characters accounted for only about 20% of the dialogue, or the screen time, but they received 69 incidents, or about 31% of all demeaning targets. Now, using dialogue again as a proxy for exposure, that works out to about 9 demeaning incidents directed at men per 1,000 male spoken words, compared with 16.4 incidents directed at female characters per 1,000 female spoken words. Again, I realize that this may get a little bit convoluted. But so relative to how much men and women were represented in the dialogue, female characters were on the receiving end of demeaning humor about 1.8 times the male rate. So quite a bit more. So the raw numbers tell us that men were the targets much more often. But relative to their presentation in the dialogue, women were actually targeted more heavily. But again, the question that we're examining here is specific. When women are demeaning somebody, who is the punchline. And The Big Bang Theory produces the strongest result out of any of the 4 shows. We were able to identify the gender of the source, right, that one doing the demeaning, in 216 of the 221 incidents. Men delivered 153 of those, while women delivered 63. And for the 4th time, who does more of the demeaning in The Big Bang Theory? The raw number is clearly men. They delivered about 71% of the demeaning comments in the sample. But now let's isolate the 63 incidents that were delivered by women. Of those 63 comments, demeaning comments that women had made, 58 were directed at male characters, only 5 directed at other women. Now that means about 92%, more than 9 of 10, of the demeaning humor that was delivered by women was aimed at men, about 8% at other women. So to simplify, when a woman made a demeaning joke or a remark, she was nearly 12 times as likely to target a man as another woman. And as with the other 3 shows, men did more of the demeaning in absolute numbers. Men were also the targets more often in absolute numbers. But because of the dialogue, and it was so overwhelmingly male, both of those raw totals do a total 180 when exposure is considered. For the central question in this discussion, the result is much more simple. When women in The Big Bang Theory demeaned or ridiculed someone, the target was almost entirely a man. Out of 63 of their female-delivered incidents, 58 were toward men, only 5 toward other women. So we'll answer those 2 questions for this last one here. Are men punchlines for women in The Big Bang Theory? Absolutely, yes. About 92% of women's demeaning humor targeted men. But then, how about this one? Are women punchlines for men? Again, not really, less than half. About 42% of men's demeaning humor targeted women, while most, 58%, targeted other men. So, oh boy, I know that was a lot of information, and thanks for sticking with me. Let's take a step back for just a moment. These 4 shows give us a rough history across 37 years of sitcoms, from Cheers in the early 1980s through Big Bang Theory that took us all the way through 2019. And across that span of nearly 4 decades, one pattern was remarkably consistent. Women delivered demeaning humor, and men were their primary targets in every show. And overwhelmingly at that. About 71% of women's demeaning humor in Cheers targeted men. It was 82% in Friends, 83% in How I Met Your Mother, and a whopping 92% in Big Bang Theory. I'm sure a lot of you probably saw that coming. And notice that in these 4 samples, the later shows actually showed an even stronger concentration on male targets. Over time, women's ridicule of men increased, or at least a proportion of it. Again, I also want to be honest and transparent here. Men delivered more demeaning humor in raw numbers in every one of the 4 shows. So I don't want to blur those 2 things together. Men did more of the demeaning and the ridicule overall. But women themselves, when they opened their mouth, they were doing the demeaning, and the target was almost entirely consistently men. Across all 4 shows, all 4 samples combined, women delivered 283 demeaning incidents, and 235 of them, about 83%, targeted men. From another angle, female to female demeaning or ridicule was the least common source target pairing in every single show. In all of these shows, women simply did not put other women down. It was very, very rare compared to them putting men down. So although the overall amount of demeaning behavior varied considerably by gender and by show, women directing it toward other women was consistently the least common pairing. Now, what changed much more from show to show was who was demeaned overall and who men targeted. In Cheers, Friends, and The Big Bang Theory, men were the major targets of those raw numbers. Although adjusting for the dialogue exposure changed the interpretation in Cheers and The Big Bang Theory. How I Met Your Mother, on the other hand, was the major exception. Women were already the majority of targets before any adjustments for, call it again, screen time. And thanks to Barney, men directed 73% of their own demeaning behavior toward women. Now, that wasn't true in the other 3 shows, where men directed only about 35% in Cheers, 47% in Friends, and 42% in Big Bang Theory. And again, even that result for How I Met Your Mother does need that context, because sexist man-slut Barney appears to account for roughly 43 of all male-to-female incidents all by himself. So one deliberately arrogant, chauvinist, and demeaning character contributes enormously to why that show looks different from the other 2. So across these 37 years, almost 4 decades of television sitcoms, the broader picture changes quite a bit. That is, the raw targets, those totals change, dialogue exposure changes, and men's targeting patterns change. But the most stable finding in the entire analysis is the one at the center of this discussion. When women demean someone, when they ridicule people, women overwhelmingly choose men as the punchline in every single one of the 4 shows. Now, I could go on about this a whole bunch more, but this video is starting to get a little bit lengthy. So leave a comment. Let's continue this discussion down there. I really do hope that you enjoyed this one. It took me a lot of time, a lot of research to prepare, and I do it all for you. So anyway, cheers. I'll see y'all soon.